Welcome to the third episode of Swallow Your Soul podcast, where the dogmen howl and the souls get swallowed. I am your tour guide to another dimension, JB. But keep in mind that once you go through the portal, there's no coming back. This is a brand new podcast that will be covering all things paranormal, 80s comedy, horror movies, and a wide range of other oddities and anomalies. With us tonight, we have Myles Shapiro. Myles, are you ready to get your weird on?
Always ready, always weird. So, hey, I don't have to try for the weird part.
Yeah. All right. Well, tonight we have a very special episode coming at you. It's our very first interview with a live person. And this interview was with a man named Joel Stern, who just recently was able to translate a book from Polish to English and get it published just last year in 2023 after trying for many, many years. He's finally successful at doing it, and the book is entitled The Elusive Force, a remarkable case of poltergeist activity and psychokinetic power. To give you a brief synopsis of this book, one of the articles we have about it states the following. It's a newly published book that recounts the terrifying story of a Polish teenager possessed with the power of psychokinesis that shocked the nation during the 1980s. Titled The Elusive Force and translated into English, the book describes the case of Joasia Gajewska, who through her logic-defying powers controlled an unexplainable force commonly known as a poltergeist. According to the book's reviewer, Rosemary Pilkington, it's one of the best documented and well-investigated examples of recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis, also known popularly as poltergeist activity. Without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the interview. All right, Mr. Joel Stern, are you with us?
Yes, I'm honored to be your guest tonight.
Well, thank you so much for coming out and joining us. You're our very first interviewee for our podcast, and we couldn't be happier about that. Myles, are you there?
I'm ready, and so is my cat, Marty.
Okay, excellent. So I already gave a brief introduction to the listeners about the case and the book, but Joel, why don't you start by giving us a brief introduction to yourself and how you ended up being the English translator for this book that was written in 1986 about events that started happening in 1983 and was translated to English not until 2023.
Well, actually, I translated the book originally in 1989. It took me 7 months. And that's a paranormal story in itself, actually. Well, let me start from the very beginning, a little about my background. I was born in Pennsylvania. My relatives came from Ukraine and Austro-Hungarian Empire. That's what sparked my interest in East European culture and languages. Eventually, I went to the University of Michigan, where I got a bachelor's degree in Russian literature and language and a master's degree in Slavic languages and literature. That's where I learned Polish. And why did I study Polish? Well, one of my favorite authors was the renowned science fiction writer Stanislaw Lem, who died not that long ago, actually. And I read a couple of his books, including Solaris, in English, and I was so impressed with his imaginative, artistry that I wanted to read him in the original, and that inspired me to study Polish. And eventually, I got a job after several years of working as a freelancer. I got a job at the State Department in Washington as a Slavic language translator, although I also worked with several other languages such as German, Hungarian, and Romanian, but mostly Russian, Polish, and to a lesser degree Ukrainian. And it was in Washington. I met a Polish couple. The husband was a bioenergy therapist named Mieczysław Wirkus, and his wife, Małgorzata, in other words, Margaret in English. And they gave me this book to read entitled Nieuwwitna Siła, which in English translates to the Elusive Force. And they encouraged me to translate the book into English, claiming that they had an American publisher who was interested in bringing it out. Unfortunately, this was not true, but I'll leave that unpleasant story for another day. I completed the translation in the summer of 1989 after 7 months of hard work, and I immediately set about finding a suitable publisher. I sent the manuscript to, I don't know, maybe 8 or 10 major publishers in the United States and England. And the reception on one hand was favorable. The subject was fascinating. They liked the translation, but unfortunately there wasn't enough publicity in the United States to warrant publication. The decision was purely an economic one, which of course is very discouraging to me personally. So eventually, after a long hiatus, I sent the manuscript to Dr. Richard Broughton. I don't know if that name means anything to you, but he was head of the Duke Parapsychology Laboratory in Durham, North Carolina. He read the manuscript, was enthusiastic about it, and he featured a chapter of my translation in his book, published in 1991, Parapsychology, the Controversial Science. Unfortunately, Dr. Broughton wasn't able to find a publisher for me, but I didn't give up. I sent the manuscript to other researchers, including one in Britain named Guy Lyon Playfair, who had written a book on poltergeist, a case of poltergeist in England. He read the manuscript, made a few suggestions on, technical matters, technical terminology, which proved very helpful to me. And another long hiatus of many years passed, and in 2010, through mutual contact, I got in touch with the publisher named, White Crow Books in England, who wanted to bring out the book, but there was a difficulty in that the publisher was in England, the authors were in Warsaw, they don't know English, and I, the translator, live in the United States, and it proved extremely difficult to forge a mutually agreeable contract between the three parties living in different countries. So unfortunately, despite our best efforts, that deal fell through. So another long hiatus followed, and the end of 2022, I believe, or sometime in 2023, I made one last attempt. I sent the manuscript to several professional researchers in the field of paranormal studies, one of whom, Annalisa Ventola, who's the head of the Parapsychology Foundation, which is headquartered in Ohio, I believe, advised me to send the text to Mr. Patrick Huyghe, who owns Anomalous Books in Charlottesville, Virginia. And by a stroke of good luck, Mr. Huyghe was enthusiastic about my translation and the subjects in general, and he agreed to publish the book. So after further arduous negotiation with the surviving co-author, Anna Osticka, who publishes a New Age magazine in Warsaw, we finally brought the book into life in July of 2023, 6 months ago. So that's the story of the publication of the book.
Wow.
34 years.
That's incredible, and you are one persistent man, Joel.
Well, that's one of my character traits. If I believe in something strongly, I do not give up.
Excellent. That is awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much for that explanation, Joel. And if you would, for our listeners, can you kind of give a brief synopsis of the book and the story and basically the case in general?
Oh, wow. Well, I'll try my best to do it in order and as succinctly as possible. In the spring of 1983, specifically during the Easter holiday in April of 1983, quite inexplicably and suddenly, paranormal events, that is, psychokinetic phenomena, started occurring literally overnight in the apartment of this Polish family, the Gajewski family, in the town Sosnowiec, which is in Silesia in southern Poland. These unusual destructive phenomena were witnessed by not only the Gajewski family themselves, but by neighbors and also by police officials who were sent to investigate this matter. At first, it thought that the family was playing some kind of prank or committing a hoax, but the specialists who were brought in to study this matter quickly realized that no hoax was involved, that these events were genuine and causing tremendous destruction to the apartment, and nothing could be found to stop it. The family even brought in a priest to exorcise, this supposed spirit, but that failed to work. The town authorities moved the Gajewski family to another apartment in the town of Chelaj, which is near Sosnowiec. It's kind of like a suburb. But the events still occurred. It wasn't a question of location. Apparently the girl, Joasia, who was 13 years old at the time, was causing some sort of local gravitational disturbance, for lack of a better description. And the case eventually came to the attention of several teams of specialists, including a biophysicist, metallurgy specialist, physicians, psychologists, and so forth. She was studied for over 40 months by 3 or 4 teams of specialists who, performed various experiments, tests, hundreds of tests over these period of 40 months, and they ruled out any possibility of a hoax. In other words, this phenomenon was genuine, but no cause could be found, with the tools, the equipment at their disposal. They could only formulate hypotheses. And the last 2 chapters of the book present these hypotheses in very detailed form. I think that's the essential story. I mean, there are many other strands, but the phenomenon was proved. We do not have an explanation, only hypotheses. And that's the state of our knowledge today. We only have hypotheses.
Sure.
And I'll go into that further as we, continue the discussion.
Okay.
Feel free to interrupt me at any time with questions. I presented the case as, concisely as I could, but, it's very complex.
Sure, absolutely.
Each chapter has a fascinating insight into the life of the family, the activities of the researchers. I mean, it's not a dry scientific treatise. One of the reasons I translated the book was that it has a wider public relevance. You know, how does a 13-year-old teenager cope with these inexplicable phenomena? You know, that's disrupting the family life, that disrupting her, her schooling. You know, it's a great human interest story.
It is, and I really couldn't agree with you more, Joel. I've listened to thousands of podcasts and read countless stories, and this one really stands out as just really, you know, a very interesting, proven case, in my opinion. The fact that she was, very credible, studied for 40 months. I mean, yes. That is a very long time with many, many different people witnessing these things, which leads me to my next question. Uh-huh. And this may be more of your opinion, as we discussed earlier, but
of course.
I keep seeing it called, you know, poltergeist activity. What is to make us believe that instead of the fact that Joasia might be the one that's causing these things to happen and not so much a poltergeist?
Well, that's an excellent question. And that is where people in the paranormal field split. I sent you a review, for example, from the Australian Journal of Parapsychology.
Yes.
Written by Rob Tilley, and he takes a distinctly spiritualist approach. He frankly said that he believed that Joasia had somehow accessed what he called higher dimensions of consciousness, and that created a psychic opening for a spirit, you know, the poltergeist spirit, to cause the mischief.
Mm.
Whereas the other review I sent you by Rosemary Pilkington for the Journal of Scientific Information takes a completely opposite approach, strictly scientific. You know, there's no spiritualism involved, that Joasia, in some inexplicable way, created a gravitational disturbance through hormonal imbalance. You know, she was in a stage of puberty. Mm-hmm. Plus, she was very upset after the death of her grandmother shortly before the case started. And the combination of her psychic distress and her hormonal changes somehow led to this, well, what you call psychokinetic storm. And what is my own opinion? It could be either or both. I don't. In cases of RSPK, which is recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis, that's what it's called. There could be conceivably some sort of entity, for lack of a better term, that intrudes and creates a disturbance for whatever reason. But that isn't necessarily always the case. This is a very complex phenomenon. So what is my own opinion? It could be either, or possibly both. But let's say that it was some sort of entity that started this chain of events. That doesn't explain how Joasia was able to channel this energy into controlled psychokinetic power. She was able to bend spoons. She had telepathic abilities. Did the spirit grant her, telepathic power? You know, appealing to the agency of the spirit doesn't explain, how should I say it? It is explaining one phenomena with a phenomenon that's also unexplained. It doesn't really. Do you understand? It doesn't. So,
right.
So I tend to, in this particular case, I tend to believe that it was a question of hormonal interaction with her brain configuration that started this chain of events and that led to these various powers. Now, why her? I can't explain that. Why did it stop after 7 years rather than 1 year? There's no explanation. But that's the whole subject of the book, the hypotheses. What caused these? Why did they stop? Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. It does. And yeah, it's hard to decide, which way makes more sense, in my opinion. But I guess, if I had to guess, I would say that she definitely has some sort of innate abilities, and maybe that did welcome some sort of spirit, ghost, poltergeist, whatever you want to call it. That in one of those articles you sent me basically said perhaps this poltergeist realized that she could basically see it or interact with it, or basically knew it existed, and then, attached to her from there. So it's all very interesting stuff. Nobody really knows, but the more info we can get out there and talk about, we can all formulate our own opinions, and maybe one day we'll have more answers.
Well, each case, I think, should be judged on its own merit.
Sure.
It's a very complex phenomenon, and I don't think there's one single explanation. That's my opinion. It has to be studied individually. This phenomenon has to be studied individually.
Yes.
And I
agree.
think, there's Rob Tilley for the Australian Journal of Parapsychology. He admitted that he didn't understand the scientific theorizing in the book, but he felt entitled to impose his own spiritualist explanation. I thought this was very presumptuous of him.
Yeah.
There was no evidence that Joasia had access to what he called higher dimensions of consciousness. She was an ordinary teenager. She wasn't interested in witchcraft. She didn't dabble in Ouija boards or anything like that. It happened quite inexplicably. And it's one thing to propose hypotheses, but to dismiss other hypotheses just because you don't understand them, to me, that's arrogant and unwarranted.
Sure. I'm sure Myles and I both agree with that.
I definitely do. I was also curious, when you are faced with this kind of experience, so seeing this or interacting with it in academia, it must on some level kind of threaten their paradigm. And can you talk about maybe if there's any psychological reactions to such abnormal events?
Well, the book itself presents the reactions of the academic community in Poland at that time. Back in the 80s, a very conservative society, and the researchers, the specialists who studied her, faced great obstacles. Sometimes they couldn't reveal their identity.
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, right. They were fearful of their, losing their, reputation, even their positions. However, a number of them did come forth, and like Dr. Eugeniusz Gadula, who was a surgeon and who headed the research on the Gajewski case. He had the courage to, present his, ideas publicly, and he's a major figure in the book. The academic community, I think, is still very skeptical towards matters of this nature. I mean, I'm not a professional researcher, but from what I understand, paranormal studies are not granted the respect that, conventional sciences are given. Sure. Yeah, it's regrettable, but people cling to their old paradigms. It's comfortable.
It's very comfortable.
Yeah,
exactly.
It does challenge the materialist paradigm, especially when you do start talking about spirits, because then we don't have really a way to measure spirit to make it objective. So it's difficult to prove. But when you have objects that are moving, that can be observed. That can be very frightening.
Well, and there were numerous observers, trained, physicians, nurses, scientists, and either these people were suffering from a mass delusion or they witnessed something, genuine. And I tend to give them credit for their, observations, their testimony. I think at least it's worth considering instead of being dismissed out of hand.
Right.
Yeah. Especially with 40 months of observation, it's hard to have a mass hallucination for that long, right?
Well, I agree with you. How could a 13-year-old girl perpetuate a hoax?
Right, and why?
Such a long period, with dozens of observers, not just in one scientific research center, but in several. It strains my credulity to believe that she could have pulled this off.
Yeah. Right. So that leads me to my next question for you,
sure.
Joel. I know you were with the family back in 1990, I believe.
Well, 1890. Okay, shortly after I translated the book, in the summer of 1989, I went to Poland in October of that year to visit the authors in Warsaw, and they took me by car to the town of Cited, where Joasia and her family lived. And that's where I met her. And, yes, that was my first meeting.
What I heard from these articles, or what I read, rather, is that when people shook her hand, they felt some sort of energy. Did you shake her hand and feel
I'm sure I shook her energy, but I didn't feel any jolt.
Okay.
At that time. At least I don't recall it.
Okay. And did you feel anything weird physically in your body, in the atmosphere, in the air?
No.
Okay.
No, but I did notice she had very piercing eyes.
Okay.
I sent you a few photographs.
Yep.
And it's quite evident that as for any physical effect upon me personally, I did not feel it, no. Gotcha.
All right. And I know I think in an email you told me that you witnessed her bend a spoon.
Actually,
did you
twice.
witness?
Both
Twice.
When I visited her in 89 and in the summer of 1990, she apparently liked me, so she decided to bend a steel spoon, and she did so right before my eyes by rubbing it for a couple minutes with one or two fingers. And I was standing a few feet away from her. I watched the spoon bend like a pretzel, and I kept both of these spoons. They're twisted, grotesquely. I don't think the strongest man in the world could unbend them and straighten them out. It was, that's my one paranormal experience.
Yeah.
It was a revelation, that made me a believer in at least spoon bending.
Right. And but you didn't witness her do anything that she was able to do with just her mind. She actually physically touched it.
Yes. With
Gotcha.
Either one or two fingers, I don't remember. Just bent, sort of like melted. The handle of the spoon. I don't know how to describe it, like a drooping flower, suddenly drooping.
Okay. All right. I found it interesting that the book review says that when they studied this phenomenon, they found that it wasn't magnetic, electric, or electromagnetic, and that it was the end of all recognized laws of physics. This relates back to the book's title, in my opinion, a force
Yes.
that cannot be measured or quantified with our current understanding of how the universe works. Is that kind of your take as to...
Yes, we don't have the scientific knowledge or the equipment
right
at this present stage to gauge the effects or to determine the exact cause of this particular phenomenon.
Right. Exactly. And you hear that a lot with these cases. We just don't have the proper equipment to measure and quantify it. With that said, it also, the article talked about how the townspeople, kind of their reaction about it, and how they would swarm the house, knock on the doors, knock on the walls, calling Joasia a witch, wanting to burn her at the stake.
Well, I wouldn't go that far. The authors say that had the case occurred a few centuries ago, no doubt some of these people would have volunteered to burn her at the stake, but she was regarded with superstitious fear, just exasperation, because she couldn't control some of these effects, even when she was sleeping. These destructive phenomena would occur. And it frightened the neighbors, understandably, what was going on.
I would be frightened too if she was my neighbor.
And people were injured by flying glass, flying objects. They were struck on the head. They were cut by flying glass. I mean, the girl herself was injured. It sounds funny, but it was no laughing. It was no laughing matter to the family. Yeah. I saw I was in their apartment. It was battered. It was really battered.
Wow. That's interesting. So this the investigation, if you will, went on for about 40 months. Mm-hmm. Do you have any opinion as to why or how the activity diminished after, what did you say it was, about 7 years?
I don't have any opinion on that because, frankly, I don't know the circumstances of that. I visited her in 1990, and I didn't witness any untoward, psychokinetic events. I don't have any particular opinion about what happened at that time. Why did it stop? Nobody knows. It's not just an opinion. Nobody knows.
You're right.
It started suddenly, and it ended suddenly. Why? Did the spirit leave? Did her powers diminish? I'm not aware of any explanation.
Yeah. The review also stated that the skeptic said, when people die, they stay dead. So they couldn't understand the energy of a poltergeist. Why do you think that they assume this poltergeist was ever living? That's a bit assuming to me.
Well, I told you my opinion on Mr. Tilley's review. He was presumptuous. He imposed his own, viewpoint on the phenomenon when there was no evidence for doing that. She showed no tendency towards spiritualism. She never dabbled in sorcery. She was an ordinary 7th grade teenager who showed no interest at all in paranormal, subjects. So he was completely unwarranted in imposing his own belief on this case. There was no justification for that.
Was there at any time any indication that her family members or people that she knew were involved with the occult by chance?
No. In fact, the authors, they point that out in the book. They show no outward religious. They were Catholics, but there was no religious symbolism.
They weren't doing any rituals or anything like that?
No. He was a plumber. The husband was a plumber. The wife was a telephone operator. There was no evidence that they ever engaged in any occult practices.
Interesting.
Again, I have no proof. I've never lived with them, but
right. There's no evidence of it. So
no evidence that would justify Mr. Tilley's claim of some sort of spiritual invasion. To me that's absurd.
Yeah. It's interesting. I hear a lot of these stories about if we were able to possibly measure consciousness to some degree. And if we were, maybe that would lend us a little bit more of an understanding as to how these activities happen outside of electromagnetism, magnetism, electricity, and all the forces that we do understand. But what were your beliefs in these types of paranormal phenomenon before you heard about this event, and how did that change, or did it not change how you believe these events to be now?
Okay, it's a very relevant question. I did not have any strong convictions one way or another. I would describe myself as an agnostic. I'm open to alternative explanations without being committed to any particular one. I think my interest in unconventional subjects began with my reading of a book called Rolling Thunder. Does that title mean anything to you? It's the story of an American Indian shaman written by Doug Boyd around 1975, and I was totally fascinated with his portrayal of this American Indian shaman named Rolling Thunder. And later on, I read books by the Don Juan series by Carlos Castaneda, which was really big back in the 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
And that further interested me in, let's say, the unconventional, the hidden side of reality.
Sure.
I think that's what sparked my interest. But I never engaged in paranormal research as a professional. It was just sort of a strong interest, I would say, rather than any, particular belief system.
Yeah, gotcha.
So the book didn't change my belief. It convinced me of the reality of this particular case, which doesn't mean I believe in the reality of all paranormal occurrences. As I told you before, each case has to be judged on its own merits.
Mm-hmm.
There's no one explanation for all these events. There can't be. Human, the universe is too complex to be reduced to one explanation.
It is, and a lot of these. It's in this field. It seems like when you find out one bit of information, all it does is create another 10 questions. Well,
that's what science should be.
Yeah, that's right.
An unending quest for further questions, because there's never going to be a final answer.
Right.
Never going to be. We're limited. I take this view. I'm limited by my 5 senses.
Yep.
To a being endowed with greater senses, greater intellect, greater consciousness, his or her view of the world will be appropriately wider and more comprehensive.
Sure. To prepare for this podcast, I went online and Googled the case and everything, and I was surprised that there isn't more information on there aside from, book reviews and the articles that you sent me, which, by the way, under the YouTube video for this podcast, I'm going to have all these links, and I'm also going to have some of the pictures included in the YouTube video as well.
Great. I'm pleased to hear that. Well, the problem was I couldn't break through the publishing industry. Mania for profits. That's the long and the short of it. It was only a question of money. If I had managed to do that back in 1990, the world would have heard about it much sooner. That's the grit, the unpleasant truth of the matter. Much valuable material will never be seen because of language barriers, because of mercenary, motivation of the publishing industry. It's a damn shame, It's, of course, and the resistance of the, academic establishment that doesn't want to see its cherished paradigms, fall by the wayside, That's another important, factor.
When it comes to the scientific community and paranormal thinking or activity, I always think of the time before we knew about microorganisms and the proposal that there might be invisible creatures in our skin causing diseases. That sounds paranormal to me. And so I think a lot of times,
absolutely,
paranormal becomes normal. But
one generation's magic is the next generation's science.
Exactly.
The case of X-rays in 1895, discovered by Röntgen,
Yeah.
People thought he was delusional. How can there be invisible rays?
Right.
And it's an old story.
Exactly. And I think it was I forget her name, the scientist that proposed to wash our hands before doing surgery.
Oh, no, that was Lister. Joseph Lister. He was a doctor, Parisian doctor, Joseph Lister.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's a perfect example of how we're so used to holding on to orthodoxy that we condemn new ideas, even if they're true.
Well, true science is open science.
Right.
It's not closed. Otherwise, it's called what's known as scientism.
Exactly.
The belief that science is complete, has all the answers, that there's nothing beyond the scientific paradigm. That's scientism. That's not true science.
100% agree.
But that's a topic for a very long discussion on another occasion.
Yeah.
Sure is. Well, Myles, unless you have any other questions, or Joel, if you have any other statements, we're kind of nearing the end of our time here.
That went quickly.
It did. It was a fun conversation. And Joel, Myles and I know I speak on his behalf too, that we just can't thank you enough for being our first interviewee on Swallow Your Soul podcast. Hopefully you go down in history, and we would love for that to be the case, obviously. But, again, we want to plug the book.
Yes.
The book
Thank
is
you
called
very much.
The Elusive Force, a remarkable case of poltergeist activity and psychokinetic power. And where can they find this book, Joel?
Well, the publisher is Anomalous Books, which has a website. It features a wonderful catalog of subjects, from UFOs to cryptids to psychic phenomena, and the book can be obtained through major outlets such as Amazon, Barnes and Noble, and many others, internationally. And of course, it's available on Kindle and Kobo in a digital ebook form. So, there's no problem in obtaining it.
Excellent.
Understood. Okay. Well, we're going to end it there, folks. And Joel, thank you so much for your time. I befriended you on Facebook, so we can discuss this further in the future. And if anything changes, maybe we can get you back on this podcast or something else. But thank you so much. Yeah, that was a really fun conversation, and thank you so much for joining us tonight. And
it's been a great pleasure, and thank you again for having me. And have a wonderful evening, both of you.
You too. Well, thank you so much, Joel.
Goodbye.
Take care, man.
Bye.
Well, what an interview that was, huh, Swallowers? Oh, man, we're so lucky to have Joel Stern come on tonight for our very first interviewee. We couldn't ask for a better person to interview. Very grateful. Thank you so much for your time, Joel. You can currently find us at YouTube at Swallow Your Soul Podcast. And if you have any experiences or want to contact us, email us at swallowyoursoulpodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you, and we're happy to keep you anonymous if you prefer. We're going to start putting some prank phone calls at the end of these podcasts. These were done by myself and Myles, and we figured we'd do that just to bring a little comedic humor to these podcasts and just kind of get the pranks out there, because
I wanted to give a shout out to
they're pretty funny in their own right, in our opinion.
This story gets famous.
Anyway, thanks so much for listening,
and
stay tuned for the next episode of Swallow Your Soul Podcast. We out.